All right, history scholars, it's Mr. Newcomb here. It's ready to take on some paper 2 topics, and this we're going to look at topic 10, the fun authoritarians. And I'm going to break this session into 3 parts. Part 1 will deal with Joseph Stalin. Part 2 will deal with Adolf Hitler, and Part 3 will deal with Mao Zedong. All right, on to Joseph Stalin here. He is the authoritarian for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the Soviet Union. And because he is a communist, that puts him as a left-wing leader. Now, Stalin and his ideology and the nature of the state, before we get to that, take a look at that photo. There you go. Perfect for a boy band. All right, back at it. Stalin and his ideology. From 1922, Lenin had suffered a series of strokes. Policy differences and personal rivalries between others leading communists came to force. And this was the moment that allowed Stalin to begin to emerge here. After Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin began to argue that Trotsky and Trotskyism were ideologically opposed to Marxism and Leninism. So he's trying to find a way to distance himself from his big rival, Leon Trotsky. Stalin favored the idea of socialism for one country, while Trotsky favored the idea of permanent revolution. So we've definitely got different views here. So when we look at Stalin, a little bit more about his ideology and the nature of the state, Stalin seemed to be in full control of the Soviet Union once the purges had begun. At first, Stalin used the party machine to reassert his control over the military, and several top commanders were demoted. Stalin then virtually ignored leading party bodies such as the Politburo and the Central Committee, and he moved the Soviet Union towards a totalitarian state. So how does he go about doing all that? Well, we have to look at his ability to consolidate and maintain his power. And so by 1929, Stalin had defeated the left, the United Opposition, and the right opposition. So that was very important to get rid of the different factions. Stalin backed the Lenin enrollment in 1923 and 1925, and this expanded the party membership. It brought in people more in line with Joseph Stalin, and most likely would just simply go along with whatever he said. He feared his opponents might work their way back into the party, so he has to find a way to permanently get rid of them. So like Leon Trotsky is going to be exiled. Stalin becomes concerned that the Red Army generals might try to remove him from power, and eventually they're going to be purged as well. Problems begin to emerge in several of the party congresses. Problems with Stalin's economic policies caused significant criticisms to emerge at the 16th Party Congress in 1930. Some were beginning to question, whether or not his economic policies can lead the Soviet Union in that industrialized direction. In 1932, he's going to get a lot of criticism from Ryutin. And this issue reveals that this continuing dissent among the Politburo members existed, and this individual had been a Bolshevik from the beginning and really felt that Stalin was not fit to be the leader and wanted to bring more of the old Bolsheviks back, get them restored. He didn't necessarily want to execute Ryutin, but by 1936-37, in the Great Purge, he does get executed along with some of the other rivals here. And at the 17th Party Congress in 1934, again, it continues to reveal more criticism and the popularity of an alternative, Kirov, and Kirov is going to end up being assassinated. So when we look at consolidating and maintaining power here, Stalin is going to continue to try to find ways to marginalize and isolate and remove his opponents. So continuing with this consolidation, Stalin ordered a series of arrests and execution. Uh, Zinoviev and Kamenov were given prison sentences. In August of 1936, the first show trial was held and the Great Purge was launched. Other show trials took place in 1937, 1938. The Great Purge was undertaken by the NKVD, which becomes the KGB, and sometimes this is referred to as the Great Terror. And no one was safe from this Great Terror. Ordinary citizens, all the way up to high-ranking Bolsheviks, end up finding themselves getting purged. In 1937, this spread to include the purge of the officer corps of the armed forces, as well as the Communist Party members. Going at the armed forces, wanting to get rid of maybe anyone who still might be connected to the old White Army that was invited to be part of the Red Army early on. Get rid of any influences that Trotsky may have had, because he is the architect of the Red Army. This is greatly going to hurt the Soviet Union when it comes time for World War II. The Great Purge allowed local party bosses in regions away from Moscow to further their own positions. Ordinary people saw the punishment of the middle class experts as part of the social revolution that would give them jobs. So there is other motives being used here. As a result of the Great Purge, several millions of people were arrested and large numbers were executed or sent to the gulags. Also part of this consolidating, maintaining power, a cult of personality is being established here. Society becoming more dependent on Stalin. So when we look at his domestic policies and their impact, by 1928, problems with the agricultural production under NEP, the New Economic Policy, which was associated with Lenin, led to Stalin to consider collectivization or collectivizing of agriculture and to push for a more rapid industrialization. I mean, as a result of this, it was a huge change in the citizens of the Soviet Union's life, since the vast majority of people of the Soviet Union were involved in agriculture. But it was a way to create this rapid industrialization. It meant taking out a class known as the kulak class, or the middle class farmers, or more successful farmers, but it was, in Stalin's way, a need to happen in order to push for a more rapid industrialization. So in 1928, the first 5-year plan for industrialization was established. Focus was on heavy industry. You got to create the big steel plants, manufacturing plants that's going to be necessary for them to move into the industrialized phase and become this industrialized giant, perhaps. And I've already mentioned in 1929, the Soviet Union announced the forced collectivization, which meant the kulaks would have to be eliminated, and as many as 1.5 million of them are deported or become victims. There is going to be a disruption in the agriculture at first here. It's going to lead to a famine as they are making this transition. To continue with the domestic policies, the second 5-year plan continued the emphasis on heavy industry. Shock brigades of super workers were set up to encourage workers to beat targets. Incentives were there, and Stahovyites would be the kind of the example of what you need to do here. In 1938, the third 5-year plan began, which concentrated on light industry and consumer goods. Despite unrealistic targets and practical problems, industrial production increased, and many new railways, canals, dams, let's back up on that one, and industrial centers were built. So through this kind of shock therapy of the Soviet Union, by 19 1940, you could make a claim that the Soviet Union has become more industrialized, that Joseph Stalin has moved them in that direction. And those who have survived the purges, their life is improving. Of course, with World War II getting ready to set in, a lot of this is going to be put on hold, and um, it's going to be hard to sustain. So when we look at more with the domestic policies here, Stalin will assert his control through the social policies. Minorities are going to be, they're going to, through Russification, uh, ethnic minorities are going to be moved to various parts of the Soviet Union. The decolonization of the Soviet Union will occur as well to try to get rid of that bourgeois or middle class farming group. When we look at religion, frowned upon to attend church, but it's going to be hard to eradicate. And he realizes during World War II he's going to have to use the church to his advantage, and so it's allowed to return. When we look at the youth here, for the Soviet Union or for the political party, it's not necessarily mandatory to attend, but if you want to move up in the communist ranks, if you want to have access to any of the privileges, you are going to want to become a member of the Communist Party. And for the youth, the best way is to join the Komsomol, which is kind of like their schooling to be a Communist Party member. Education is going to be viewed as a way to help transform into the socialist state, attempt to make education more accessible. More working class children would gain access to high level education. Education became tied to work, vocational. Early on in the revolution, or after the revolution, there was a huge literacy campaign going on here. For the arts, the focus was on the socialist state. Themes appeared in music, literature, and art. Those that supported the official ideology lived comfortable lives. And so that always leads to that question about artistic, when you look at artistic freedom of expression, and are you engaging in that if you are following the official government line here, and so there's a great confusion and debate there. For women, in theory, improved access to education, employment opportunities, and enlistment in the military. However, during the 1930s, you had the Great Retreat, where because of the birth rate in the Soviet Union was declining, Stalin goes in a more conservative direction here, and women were encouraged to be mothers, stay home. Divorce becomes harder, and abortions become illegal. All right. Ultimately, Stalin's rule comes to an end because of health reasons, and he dies in 1953. It's important to note that Joseph Stalin does not emerge as a leader in an authoritarian state. It's already established. His predecessor, Vladimir Lenin, would be an emerging leader. Stalin is coming out of an established state. All right, the part 2 of this segment will be focusing on Adolf Hitler.